Hello, I am Rusty Fields, and today we're going to learn about ancient Greece, specifically Athens versus Sparta. So let's get into it. Students will define key Greek terms, you'll identify differences between Athens and Sparta, and you'll design a Greek city-state by the end. And so specifically, we're going to have an opening question. We're going to look at those terms. We're going to talk about Athens, then we're going to talk about Sparta, and then we're going to have that activity. Sparta. So, what do you know about ancient Greece already? Do you know its mythology? Prometheus, the Greek god, Zeus, Aphrodite. Do you know about Medusa? Do you know about the Iliad? Whatever you know, whatever. Do you know it from popular culture? The movie 300 or the Percy Jackson novels series? Or do you know more about its architecture? Do you know it as a bunch of just old ruined buildings that pillars are still stand, but that's about it? Thousands of years old, still standing. It's amazing. Whatever you know, there's a lot in ancient Greece that's worth knowing. There's a lot of things that come from it that are still relevant to our society today. From our architecture, a lot of buildings are modeled after ancient Greek buildings. And things like government is very important, like democracy. So let's kind of get into that. Our key terms that you need to know is demos. That's Greek for the people, which are all the citizens. The demos is the mass. If you're rich or poor, you're part of the demos, which leads into democracy, which is ruled by the people. United States is a democracy. We elect our leaders and vote on things. So in ancient Greece, the Athens was ruled by the people. It was a democracy. On the other hand, you have the oligarchy, which is kind of the opposite. It's the rule of the few. So the rich and the wealthy elites, the people that owned all the farms, owned all the money, all the land, all the power, they rule the city. So a couple other terms that you'll know will be ostracism, which is a banishment. I'll get more into that later. And then helots, which are Spartan slaves, which we'll also get into later. So here's a map of Greece with Athens more to the north. It was pretty close to the coast, so its navy was a lot more important to it. And then you had Sparta, which was on the Peloponnese, which is connected by this little land bridge. And so it was more inland, so its army was a lot more important to it, as you'll know. But first we'll talk about Athens. Its leader that kind of helped create democracy and a lot of these reforms that we know, his name's Solon. He helped standardize the currency, made it all the same weight. So, some currency wasn't worth more than others, tried to make everything equal. And he also set the foundations for democracy. All male citizens were part of the assembly. So all male, that excludes all women. So women had no say in anything that went on in Athens, nothing directly. And male citizens got to vote. Leaders were elected through the lottery system. So they would get a name out, and that whatever name it came up with would be the leader for, I believe, a year. Now, they were smart enough to have their generals be elected through vote, as you want a guy with military experience to lead the military, so they would be able to be voted in. So courts were for everyone, and everyone had the right to appeal to a jury, which was massive compared to what the United States has. The court with Socrates had hundreds of people, if not thousands. It's always at least 500 people there, and they all vote on whether you're guilty or innocent. So what's an ostracism? It requires 6,000 votes to kick someone out of the city for 10 years. So if there is a guy, a leader, who is getting corrupt and is very unpopular, he's making things worse, if 6,000 people voted for him, he would be banished. He would have to leave Athens for 10 years, and then he'd be allowed to come back. And so every person would get to vote, and if 6,000 people voted for one, they were gone. So Athens also cared a lot about philosophy. This is where Socrates, Plato, Aristotle came in. They all lived in Athens and had big major. All of their schools were in Athens, and they were there quite often. And art was very important with theater. Theater, a lot of plays came from Athens, a lot of buildings, a lot of architecture, a lot of things came from Athens. And so their navy was also very important to them. Like I said, they lived near the coast, and another thing is on the boats, everyone would have to have an oar and row together. They had to be organized. And so that group of men on the ships would be very important in the democracy, since you had to work together to get anything done. So with that connection, we'll move on to Sparta. So Sparta's reformer was a guy named Lycurgus. Something interesting about him, his solution to the wealth problem was to make currency basically worthless in Sparta. So he had the currency be the iron diluted and big and awkward to carry. And he also banned trade from the outside world of Sparta. And, some other things he did was require everyone to eat together, wear the same clothing, and just try to really bring everyone to be equal. There was no wealthy, there was no poor. It was just Sparta. But they still were an oligarchy, and they did have noble families. They had two kings, two different families. Their dynasty would rule. Two kings, one would go to war, and the other would stay home, that kind of thing. They also had 30 elected leaders, which included the kings, and they were usually noblemen. And then they also had 5 ephors, which were the most powerful group in Sparta. They could override the kings or the other 30 elected officials, and 2 of them always had to go with a king if they went to war in order to report back to the rest of the ephors. So, like I said, Sparta was very focused on their military. When a child became 7 years old, they had to go and train to be a soldier, and they had to serve in the military for a while. And so Sparta had a very strong, very elite land army. And the reason for this was because of the Helots. So the Helots made up almost 90% of Sparta's population, and they were all slaves. They did the farming, they did the construction, they did everything, all the dirty work. And so Sparta could do whatever it wants and basically could become a military. And they became a military so they can put down the Helots. Since the Helots were so much bigger, they would always rebel. So every year, Sparta's military would go to war with the Helots and cause complete chaos on them. Now, something interesting is the women in Sparta. Spartan women are very famous. You had people like Gorgo. She was a fiery woman. Women were allowed to own land, and so a lot of times there'd be very wealthy women that were able to make some influence. And they were very dedicated to making Sparta that strong military. Spartan women had to be strong to give birth to strong Spartans. That's their ideology. So let's compare the two. Athens, you had the democracy. Every male got to vote, be involved in politics. Their society was very focused on art and theater and philosophy and science. And their navy was their focus. They were a very powerful navy. And women had almost no rights. Meanwhile, Sparta was an oligarchy. Its society was very focused on their military. They had a very elite and powerful land army. And the reason for that, remember, is the Helots. And their women, while not having a lot of rights, still had more than your typical Greek. So our activity is going to be designing a city-state. Think about how you would want it to be led. Do you have it be a democracy where everyone gets to vote? Well, what if there's a leader that comes in and sways everyone to make poor decisions? Socrates was executed because of the democracy, and a lot of people critiqued it. Do you do an oligarchy where just a few people have power? Are there term limits? Think about that. How would you prevent class warfare from happening like Solon did or like Lycurgus? Does everyone have right to court? How big is the court? Do you need hundreds of thousands of people voting? Or you just need a small group? How is that picked? And then would your society be focused on its military, or would you rather focus on art and theater? So work in groups and come up with something. We'll present that at a later date. And that is all I have. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.